So in math, there's two terms called the lowest common multiple and the lowest common denominator. Lowest common denominator or least common denominator, it's the same thing. So sometimes people get confused what the difference is between these two terms. So in this video, I'm going to demonstrate and hopefully clearly show you what the difference between the lowest common multiple and the lowest common denominator is. So let's start with the lowest common multiple. So the lowest common multiple is when you have two numbers, say 3 and 7. So we want to find the lowest common multiple between these two numbers. Okay, so if I was to make a list of the multiples of each number, so say for 3, I make a list of the multiples of 3. So you would have 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, and etc. Right? I can keep going. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding 3 each time. Okay, so that's basically what a multiple is. We're basically adding the number each time. And so if we do the same thing for 7, what do we get? We have 7. 7 plus 7 is 14. And 14 plus 7 is 21. And we can keep going. 28, 35, and etc. So now we made a list of number 3. We made a list of the multiples of the number 3 and 7. So now you may be able to guess what the lowest common multiple may be. So the lowest common multiple is the multiple that's common between both numbers. Okay, so how do we find that? Well, if you check both lists, do we see a number that's in this list and in this list? We don't, right? Well, that's because I haven't continued this list actually long enough. So if you were to continue this, we would get a 21, 24. Okay, so now let me ask that question again. So do we see a number that's common between this list and this list? We do, right? You see 21. 21 is common between this list and this list. So this means that 21 is the lowest common multiple of 3 and 7. Okay, so let's try another problem. So let's say we had the number 3 and 6, and I asked you to find the lowest common multiple. So again, we make a list of the multiples of 3. So we have 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, and 21. And we can keep going. And then we make a list of the multiples of 6. So we have 6, 12, 18, 24, 30, and we can keep going. Okay. So now, do we see a number that's common between this list and this list? We do, right? We see that 6 appears in the first list and it appears in the second list. But hold on. We also see another number that's common between these two lists. We see 18 and 18. So in this case, what do we do? Well, remember, going back to the term, we're looking for the lowest common multiple, right? So 6 is a common multiple of 3 and 6, and so is 18. 18 is also a common multiple of 3 and 6. But remember, we're looking for the lowest common multiple. So in fact, our answer for the lowest common multiple is actually 6. Okay, so 6 is the lowest common multiple of 3 and 6. Even though 18 is a common multiple, since we're looking for the lowest common multiple, our answer is 6. Okay, so that's how you find, so that's what a lowest common multiple is. Now going back to the beginning of our video, we wanted to know the difference between the lowest common multiple and the lowest common denominator. Okay, so now we know what the lowest common multiple is. Now what is the lowest common denominator? So the lowest common denominator, you usually hear this term when we deal with fractions. Okay, when we want to add or subtract fractions, we need to find the lowest common denominator. So for example, let's say we had the fraction 1 over 5 and we wanted to add to that 2 over 10. Okay, well, we know to add or subtract fractions, we need a common denominator, right? We need the lowest common denominator. So how do we find that lowest common denominator? Well, we actually use the lowest common multiple. Okay, so to find the lowest common denominator of 1 over 5 and 2 over 10, we need to find the lowest common multiple of the denominators. Okay, we need to find the lowest common multiple of the denominators. Okay, so in this case, we would find the lowest common multiple of 5 and 10. And again, we would write down the multiples of 5 and 10, right? So 5, 10, 15, 20, and we can keep going. And then the multiples of 10 would be 10, 20, 30, 40, and etc. So now what's the lowest common multiple of 5 and 10? It's 10, right? 10, because 10 appears in both lists. So we know that the lowest common multiple is the lowest common multiple of 5 and 10 is 10. Okay, so how does this relate to the lowest common denominator? Well, the lowest common denominator is just a special name. It's just the lowest common multiple of the denominator of these fractions. Okay, so the lowest common denominator is basically the lowest common multiple of the denominators of the fractions that you want to add or subtract. So essentially, the lowest common denominator is a special case of the lowest common multiple. Okay, so the lowest common denominator is a special case of the lowest common multiple. Okay, so just to conclude, the lowest common multiple you can find anytime with any two numbers, right? I can ask you, what is the lowest common multiple of 2 and 3? What is the lowest common multiple of 4 and 6? So the lowest common multiple you can find anytime, but the lowest common denominator is specific to fractions, right? It's specific to fractions because you're looking for the denominator of the fraction. Okay, so if we had the fraction, this as another example, 1 over 2 and 2 over 8, right? I wouldn't say find the lowest common multiple of these fractions because that doesn't make sense. I would say, well, if you want to add these fractions, for example, you need to find the lowest common denominator, right? Lowest common denominator. And we know that the lowest common denominator is just the lowest common multiple, okay, of the denominators. That's why it's called the lowest common denominator. Okay, so lowest common denominator is specific to when you're using fractions, and lowest common multiple you can find with any two numbers.